Welcome to the Movement Upgraded podcast. I'm your host, Dr. Jen Hostler, licensed physical therapist and certified strength and mobility coach. Here you can expect to hear about all things movement. The Movement Upgraded podcast is a blend of the science of strength training, rehab, and mobility, mixed with the personal and professional experience to provide you with the steps you need to keep your body pain-free and moving well, so you can do what you love forever. Welcome back to the Movement Upgraded podcast. Today we're going to talk about warm-ups. So this is something that I've gone on little tangents about here and there on my Instagram, and usually when I bring it up, I'll have several responses about warm-ups. And it's always interesting because I think we get attached emotionally to things that we do and beliefs that we hold. And I feel like warm-ups are one of those types of things in the fitness industry that everybody holds as like this identity to them. And that's common in the fitness industry. So I'm going to tread lightly with this. And if you feel like you get triggered or like emotionally charged from this, please hold off for a few minutes before you respond and send me any information or responses to this podcast. Because I'm not here to make you feel like you're always doing something wrong. In fact, I want to validate a lot of what some people might feel in the fitness industry and help give you some tangible things to think about when it comes to your own warm-up, and do a little bit of myth busting when it comes to warm-ups. So let's talk about how warm-ups typically look like and how they're perpetuated in the fitness industry. And this is something, I think this is like one of the first introductions that I had into like the movement world was the functional movement screen and movement screens in general, and the idea of correctives. And this was like the beginning of like mobility and correctives and starting to think about our bodies in beyond just like squats and deadlifts, right? We were like, okay, we're getting injured in even fitness. So how can we help reduce this? And a lot of therapists, physical therapists and clinicians started to, I think, try to come up with solutions because we see a lot of patterns. I'll say we because I notice it too. And we're always trying to be like, okay, well, are there ways that we can mitigate and prevent some of this stuff? And when the realm of these correctives came out, I feel like was really when we decided, okay, the correctives are going to be this warm up. We're going to do correctives first, and we're going to fix a lot of these issues before and perfect posture before we go into lift, because that's going to be the way that we prevent injuries, right? So if we believe that posture, which has no correlation to injuries or pain, by the way, not no, but minimal for injuries. It's very specific type of postures that really matter. Not enough to definitely have these exact postures that we want to avoid, right? So one of the concepts is rounded shoulders. If I think that rounded shoulders are bad, then I'm going to do all these drills and correctives, quote unquote, to open up the shoulders before we lift. And then the shoulders will be in a quote unquote better position and they won't get injured. The problem with that is like I already said, there's not good enough correlation to understand that is the cause of injuries because injuries are too complicated. Number two, we aren't making that big of changes in a 5-minute warm-up. And number three, is that really all that we need to do? Is that enough to actually create any changes, right? Which kind of goes along with number two. But it's not going to happen that fast is what I meant by number two. So I think that's where a lot of this like obsession with warm-ups happen. Of course, we've always looked at warm-ups from way and beyond, like earlier, beyond that, as like we need to warm up, we need to stretch, we've got to move around and get our bodies prepped. But then it has turned into these 17-step warm-ups where we're activating this right inferior glute to be able to squat. It's like kind of silly how complicated we've made things. The reason that I wanted to create a podcast about this is because, one, I think this overcomplication of warm-ups adds a barrier to actually doing the thing that matters. We, as a population, do not move enough. We just don't move enough. We are still sedentary despite all of the work that we're doing. So adding any sort of barrier that makes us feel like we have to do X before we can do Y, and Y is the thing that really benefits us, means that we are getting less people are likely to move, or people are less likely to do the thing that's important, right? So personally, if I'm not having a great mental health day, if everything feels kind of hard, if I were to have to do this 15-step warm-up, I'm just going to be like, screw that, it's not worth it, right? And I was in a gym that they had this really complicated movement prep stuff, and it was just like, wow, this is complicated, and I don't feel like I'm doing a lot, and I felt like I was spending half of my session just warming up, and I wasn't getting much out of it. So if I only have an hour and I'm spending 20 minutes warming up, that's really, really quality time, like a lot of it, that I could be doing something that has a lot better ROI for my time. ROI stands for return on investment. So if I'm putting time in, I want to make sure that if I have limited time, that the things that I'm spending or the things that I'm doing and the way that I'm spending that time is really going to give me the most out of it. And we live in a world where most people are really busy and don't have a ton of time to train for 2 hours plus every day. So we really want to make sure that we are doing the things that are going to get us the furthest, right? And 20-step warm up is not always going to do that. So this adds a barrier. That's the number one reason that I don't love the overcomplicated warm ups. The other thing is it makes us think we're taking care of our mobility. And it's one of those things that, most of these warm-ups that I'm talking about, so remember, this is generalized, so there's always going to be outliers, but most of the warm-ups that I'm seeing are going to be telling you you're focusing on mobility, but they're just movements that we don't typically do, so they like feel good, or they're quick stretches, and if you go into a movement for like 2 seconds to feel a stretch and come out of it, you're not making any permanent tissue changes. Like if we just do a bicep curl for 2 seconds twice a week, like we're not going to make any aesthetic changes. Our biceps aren't going to grow. So we cannot expect mobility to be any different. And so that's number one. But number two, the movements, so the movements are not enough to really create tissue changes, right? It's not enough a couple times a week. And two, they're not progressively overloaded. So you're doing the same things. So you're just getting better at the things you're doing, and that's it, which we know true injury mitigation is actually progressively overloading the tissues. So the tissue capacity is higher. And it's less likely that we're going to get injured. That's what true injury mitigation is. So if we're doing the same thing all the time at the same amount of weight, then we're not really mitigating injuries. So that's not true mobility training. And then number three, it's not prioritizing our joints. All movement comes from our joints. It's not from my actual arm bone. It's from my shoulder moving, right? That's our joints are what give us the capability to move. That's the point of our joints. Otherwise, we would have just been long bones. So if we really want to improve our mobility and take care of our joints, we need to actually think about our joints inside out. And most of the complicated warm-ups are not thinking from the joint inside out. They're just thinking, oh, I want to do some of these. And there's just really popular movements that we do, and we put them in there, and I've seen them, I've done them, but just because they're popular and because they're quote unquote the way we've always done something doesn't necessarily mean it's super effective. And I'm here to call that out, even if it means we get a little emotionally charged at that. So that is what, those are the two main reasons that I don't like the overcomplicated warm-ups. Now, I'm not saying that warm-ups don't have a place. If you are an elite athlete, if you are somebody who is really going for a PR, you might want to warm up a little bit more intensely, right? You're going to have a little bit more prep that you're doing. That's normal. If you're a Gen Pop is just general population, somebody who's just trying to live their life, has a hobby of fitness, likes to train so that they can feel good in their body, is just trying to train for general health, then your goal with your warm-ups are just to increase your body temperature and get your brain ready for the thing that you're going to do. And for most people, that doesn't need to be this 100-step process. If you walk into the gym and you're ready to go, technically, if you're going to do your main lift that's going to be heavy that day, you can just do your warm-up sets for that lift, especially if you're already doing your own mobility training on a regular basis. So if you're taking mobility training seriously, you're incorporating it in your lifts. You're incorporating it when you're not in the gym because we need to do daily cars every day for maintenance. You are getting serious about mobility training. So now it doesn't need to be crammed into these 5-minute sessions before your lifts a couple times a week. And your body is actually ready to go because you're taking it seriously and doing mobility training. And if you are not prepared, then one of the best things you can do, like if you're just not ready and you're not in the mindset and you're just like, I don't know, I'm not prepared, then you can just do some cars. I can't think of a single better warm up for any movement that you're about to do than taking the joints that are about to be moved through their full ranges of motion. You're lighting up your brain with that area that those sensations. That's not the word I'm looking for, but the mechanoreceptors, your proprioception. You're getting good connection from your brain to that joint. Wow, words are hard here. So if you're going to use your hips to do a squat and your knees and your ankles, why not, instead of what most movement prep does, most warm-ups is just go through like one single movement, why not take your hip through all of the movements it does? Because actually when we squat, your hip goes into external rotation, internal rotation, flexion. You go into some extension, a little bit of abduction, and we use our adductors as well. So if you're going to do all those movements, you're going to utilize some of those movements in those tissues, just do a hip car. Then you're taking care of all of them. And then you're actually doing stuff that's getting you better at your joint rather than just getting you better at a movement itself. So cars are hands down one of the top tier movement prep or warm-ups that I will typically use for my clients for those reasons. But again, like I had already said, if you're taking your mobility seriously or really progressively overloading tissues, tackling your joints from the inside out, you're really consistent with doing your stretches when you need to, which is usually going to be 4, 5, 6 days a week. When you're doing the strength loaded mobility internal training in your normal sessions and you're doing your daily cars, you get into the gym, you're ready to go. Your body is going to be ready for most life things. Think about when you go to the store. If you have to go pick up a bag of dog food that's like 50 plus pounds, are you going to sit there and do a 12-step process to pick up this bag of dog food? Or are you just going to grab the dog food, pick it up, put it in the cart, go check out and put it in your car and pick it up and move it? You're going to do that, right? You're not going to do this 12-step process every day. And so one of the things that I usually tell my clients is think about your cars as like your warm up for the day. Like it's your movement prep for daily life. And that's what joint training really is. And I think that's what fitness really is supposed to be, but we've lost sight of fitness and trying to be good at fitness without remembering that like the point of fitness is supposed to be getting better at our bodies. And a lot of us have lost sight of, well, I want to get better at this thing in fitness. Which is, it's funny to think about when we think about this, because all of fitness, the point of fitness is really to make you better at these prescribed rules and things that we created and constructs around fitness. And yes, getting a stronger squat and getting stronger with deadlifting will carry over into your life, but there's kind of a bell-shaped curve for that. And at some point, it doesn't carry over anymore. And at some point, it actually can take away from your life, right? At some point, getting stronger and getting stronger and getting stronger in this one movement, and ignoring our joints over and over again for a long part of our life actually can be detrimental for us, and it actually makes us less good at life. So a lot of the elite level athletes and powerlifters or anybody who's in sports or anybody who's really, really good at fitness, they have to ultimately sacrifice their bodies. The better we become at a sport, which is something we made up and invented, the less good at being a human or being good at our bodies we are. And if our goal is to use fitness to improve our lives, then there's going to be a certain point that we reach where we're just going to be like, hey, I don't need to do all of these fitness things. I actually need to focus a little bit on mobility training. If you're somebody who is sitting here like, okay, so I feel like I have to do 20 minutes of mobility before I lift, I will say, if you feel like you have to do the same lifting pre-lift routine to even get your joints prepared for a lift because you can't do your lift otherwise, then one, your movement prep isn't doing what you might think it is. Like it's not actually making any true changes. It's just tricking your nervous system into making you feel better so that it gives you more range of motion, but you're right back at square one the next day. Otherwise, you would have to do less and less mobility training, right? That would be a sign that you're progressing into where you need. So if that's you, then you likely need to focus less on these fitness prescribed things and a little bit more on your internal anatomy and physiology, like a little bit more on the internal biology is the word I'm looking for, of your actual joints. So that would be an example of, okay, now I need to, one of the questions that I get often a lot is, or asked a lot is, how much should I be working on mobility training? If you're somebody who is going through like an acute injury or something along those lines, or you're the person who's like, yeah, I have to do this 20-minute work or movement prep before I can lift because otherwise my joints aren't ready, then you're definitely somebody who probably just needs to spend more of their training at like a maintenance for all of your other levels of fitness and really prioritize joint training. And it's still strength training. It's just a different priority. We're just thinking from the inside out. It looks very different from what you're used to. But that's okay, right? Because it should look different than what you're used to, because what you're used to got you to this position. So we have to do something different to get us out of the position you're in. And restoring all of that joint mobility will then get you back to doing what you love, but it'll also keep you doing all of the other things you love. So fitness and a lot of the things we do in fitness is definitely a bell-shaped curve. And at some point we get to that point where it's not any longer giving us the results that we want. And in fact, it's taking away from our lives because we don't feel great anymore. And so that is going to be a perfect example of, we just need to be a little bit more serious about our mobility training. And sometimes that's really hard to come to terms with. And if you're really attached to this certain way of training and you're like, yeah, I feel like I have to do this, then that's where we may need to look into why. What part of your identity is attached to that? Why are we so against pulling back from it? If you are not comfortable with pulling back from your fitness a little bit, then there's something going on there that needs to be addressed and uncovered. And that's far beyond the realm of this podcast, maybe a future podcast. But if that's you, definitely need to unpack some of those things. But likely if your warm-up is just feeling like it's just required to get you to move, then what are we doing outside of the gym for your joints? And can we spend a little bit more time in your general fitness training working on improving your joints so that you don't need so much warming up to actually get to the point? Now, that's not to say, to wrap all of this up, that you can never just do your mobility to warm up, and you should never do mobility to warm up. I actually will program this for my clients, right? Sometimes it'll make them feel better. It'll help them squat a little bit better. It does help them feel connected to their bodies. Cars definitely do that, but sometimes I'll have them do some stretches beforehand. Yes, despite the fact there is a little bit of research to show that we have a potential for a decrease in overall strength and power. Remember, most people are not training at their max, so it's really not relevant. Just like if you are looking at the cardio versus strength, like, oh, if you do too much cardio, it kills your gains. Really, it doesn't, only if you are like at your max. And we're not talking about max athletes. I'm talking about most people, right? So if now I went off on a tangent. That's what always happens to me. But like I was saying, sometimes I do plan or program some of their mobility stuff before their lifts because it does help them feel better. But again, they are doing that outside of their movement prep. They are not using their movement prep to fix all of these problems. They're just taking what they're already doing and just being smart and being like, oh, I feel better when I do this. Let's do it beforehand. Cool. Plus, it gets you to transition into the right mindset for what you're doing, because it gets you into this mode of like thinking, which is really one of the good benefits of a warm-up. So to wrap things up overall, warm-ups do not need to be super complicated. So you don't need a 20-step warm-up. If somebody in the fitness world is telling you that, you can just be like, nope, I'm going to choose to hold on to the knowledge that I know and that's cool. You get to do that because you get to make those decisions for yourself autonomously. And we definitely don't want it to be a barrier for you doing the thing. So like I said, if there are days where I'm overwhelmed or I just don't feel up to it, I will skip my warm up, especially if I have done my cars that day. If I haven't, I just use it as a time to get my cars in because they're so important to me, because mobility is really important to me. It's more important for me to do my cars than it is for me to do an extra set of squats, for example. That's how important and how much I prioritize cars. So those are going to be the things that I want you to remember, and also keep in mind that the more that we get serious about our mobility training, the less that we have to rely on these types of movement preps. So if you are somebody who's really having to rely on this complicated warm-up, one, kind of question whether or not you're actually needing that, and if you're not just like attached to this routine, and if you can challenge yourself in that way. But two, maybe we just really do need to be a little bit more prioritized with the actual mobility training that we're not doing in the rest of our lives. So hopefully you found that helpful. If you have questions or comments, I am super happy, as long as they are not emotionally charged, to hear from you. So you can always email me, jen@movementupgraded.com, message me at Jen Hustler on Instagram, because I spend a lot of time there. If you like this podcast, again, leave us a review. It's super helpful. And if you feel like there would be somebody who would benefit from listening to this podcast, pass it along, share the goods. And thank you for listening, and I will see you on the next podcast.